Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpetbags on the dirt of the Barlow ranch yard and said the one thing a desperate woman was never supposed to say. She said it not to the weathered woman watching her from the porch, but to the vast, indifferent sky that stretched over the high country like a faded blue sheet. She said it to the dust devils dancing at the edge of the property, to the skeletal remains of a wagon near the barn, and to the bone-deep weariness in her own soul. "This is it," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. There's nowhere else to go. Her son, Leo, a boy of 6 who had not spoken more than a handful of words since his father's funeral, stood so close his shoulder pressed into her thigh. He did not look at the ranch house, or the woman, or the half-dozen curious ranch hands who had stopped their work to stare. He looked only at his mother's face, his expression as solemn and unreadable as a stone. More. If this story already has your heart, if you know the feeling of standing at the last door on the last road, then I invite you to join us on this journey. Subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. And maybe drop your city or a kind word in the comments below. It's good to know you're out there listening. Cora took a breath, the air thin and tasting of pine and hot dust. She straightened her spine, a gesture that cost her more than the last 3 miles of walking had. She was not old, not yet 30. But loss had carved years into her face, leaving behind a map of hardships where laugh lines should have been. Her dress was clean, but frayed at the cuffs, her boots worn through at the soles. Everything she and the boy owned was in the 2 bags at her feet. She picked them up, the weight familiar and discouraging, and walked toward the porch. The woman waiting there did not move. She was built of the same tough, unyielding material as the land around her. Her hair was a steel-gray braid, her face was a road map of sun and worry, and her eyes were the gray of creek stones after a hard rain. She held a tin cup of what Cora guessed was coffee, and she held it like a weapon. Looking for a hand out, the woman's voice was gravelly, accustomed to shouting over wind and cattle. "No, ma'am," Cora said, stopping at the bottom of the 3 porch steps. She set the bags down again. Her hands felt empty and unsteady without them. "I'm looking for work." The woman took a slow sip from her cup. Her gaze flickered from Cora's face to the silent boy at her side, then back again. It was a look that weighed and measured and found wanting. "This is a cattle ranch, not a charity. I got a full crew." "I don't expect charity," Cora said, her voice steady now. The initial tremor of fear had passed, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This was the last chance. It had to work. "I can cook. I can mend clothes, keep books, manage supplies. I can stretch $1 until it screams. My husband, he ran a small holding down in the flats before the fever. I learned to do everything that wasn't breaking a horse." She did not mention that the holding was gone, sold for pennies to pay debts. She did not mention the lonely grave marked by a simple wooden cross. She offered only her competence, the one thing they had not been able to take from her. The woman who Cora would soon learn was Edna Barlow, proprietor of this struggling enterprise, snorted. It was a sound of profound skepticism. I've heard that song before. Every drifter who passes through knows the lyrics. They work a week, eat their fill, and disappear with a saddle blanket. "And 2 of my good spoons." "I am not a drifter," Cora said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of absolute conviction. "And I do not steal spoons." She met Edna's hard stare without flinching. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind whistling through the eaves of the barn and the distant, mournful lowing of cattle. The ranch hands were still watching, a silent jury. From the gatekeeper's perspective, Edna Barlow saw what she expected to see. Another piece of flotsam washed up by the harsh tides of the west, a woman with a sad story in her eyes, and a silent, haunted-looking child clinging to her skirt. Edna had been running this ranch alone for 10 years, since her husband Jacob had been thrown from a horse. In those 10 years, she had become an expert in disappointment. Men she hired drank or stole, or were simply too lazy to earn their pay. Women she brought on as help complained about the isolation, or tried to catch the eye of one of her hands. Edna was tired. Her bones ached with a weariness that had nothing to do with the day's labor, and everything to do with the solitary weight of it all. This woman, her worn-out dress and her proud, desperate chin, was just another potential burden. Edna opened her mouth to send her on her way, to tell her the next town was 30 miles east and they had a church there that might help. But before the words could form, a commotion erupted from the direction of the cookhouse. A man in a filthy apron, his face red with fury, stormed out, waving a meat cleaver. "That's it, I quit," he roared, his voice cracking. "I ain't cooking for this bunch of ungrateful coyotes no more. And I ain't taking another word from you." Silas, a tall, lean man with a foreman's swagger, Cora presumed, followed him out. "You burned the beans again, drunk fool. And the sourdough starter's dead again." "It ain't my fault," Cook shrieked, throwing the cleaver into the dirt near Silas's feet. It was a theatrical, clumsy gesture. "I'm done." He stomped toward the bunkhouse, presumably to collect his meager belongings. Silas kicked at the cleaver, his face a mask of disgust. He turned to Edna on the porch. "Well, that's that. Cookie's gone. We got 20 men to feed, and the roundup starts in 3 days." Edna's shoulders slumped. It was not a large movement, but Cora saw it. It was the slump of a person facing one more problem on a mountain of them. The weight on her grew heavier. She closed her eyes for a second, her knuckles white on her coffee cup. Cora saw her opening. It wasn't the one she would have chosen, but it was the one fate had provided. She took a step forward. "You need a cook," she said. It was not a question. She looked from the fuming Silas to the abandoned cookhouse and back to Cora. The logic was inescapable, but her skepticism was a fortress. "You said you could cook?" "I said I could do everything that wasn't breaking a horse," Cora corrected gently. "That includes cooking for 20 hungry men. I can make a sourdough starter from scratch with flour, water in 3 days' time. I can make biscuits that will melt in your mouth and a stew that will stick to your ribs. And I will not burn the beans." Silas let out a disbelieving laugh. "A woman in the cookhouse for roundup, boss? You can't be serious." Edna ignored him. Her gaze was locked on Cora. She was a gambler playing her last chip, and she hated it. She hated the hope that flickered traitorously in her chest. A good cook could change the entire disposition of a crew. A bad one or no one could ruin a roundup before it even started. She looked at the silent boy, who was now watching the exchange with wide, intelligent eyes. She looked at the woman's hands. They were not soft. They were chapped and capable, the hands of someone who understood work. "All right," Edna said, the word tasting like defeat. "All right, the job is yours until the end of the roundup. 30 days. Food for you and the boy, and a cot in the storage room off the kitchen. After that, we'll see." She pointed a finger at Cora, the nail blunt and clean. "But you understand this. You burn the beans. You're on the road the next morning. You cause any trouble with my men, you're gone. Your boy makes a nuisance of himself, you're gone. This is a trial, nothing more." "Understood," Cora said. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over her. She did not smile. It was not a moment for smiling. It was a moment of transaction. She had wagered her competence against Edna Barlow's desperation, and for now, she had won a reprieve. "The cookhouse is a mess," Edna said, gesturing with her cup. "Last one was a pig. I'll clean it first," Cora said. She bent and picked up her bags one last time. "Then I'll do an inventory of the pantry. Then I'll start supper." She walked past Edna and Silas, her back straight, her son trailing in her wake like a small shadow. She did not look back. As she stepped into the dim, greasy chaos of the cookhouse, she heard Edna say to Silas, her voice low and tight, "Don't just stand there gawking. Get the men back to work, and see if you can find me 2 good spoons. I have a feeling they're missing." The inside of the cookhouse was a testament to neglect. It smelled of stale grease, sour milk, and despair. A film of grime covered every surface. Dirty pots and pans were stacked precariously by a stone sink, and a cloud of flies buzzed over a bucket of scraps in the corner. For a moment, Cora felt her hard-won resolve falter. This was not a kitchen. It was an archaeological site of culinary failure. Leo, standing in the doorway, wrinkled his nose. Cora set down her bags in the cleanest corner she could find. She looked at the mess, not as an obstacle, but as a problem to be solved, a set of tasks to be ordered and executed. First things first, she found the small windowless storage room off the main kitchen. It was dusty and smelled of mice, but it contained a cot with a lumpy mattress and a small crate that could serve as a table. It was more than they'd had the night before when they had slept in a dry creek bed. "This is our room for now, Leo," she said softly. The boy looked around, his gaze lingering on a spiderweb in the corner, but he did not complain. He sat on the cot, his small legs dangling, and watched her. Cora tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and rolled up her sleeves. She found a bar of lye soap and a stiff bristled brush. For the next 3 hours she worked with a silent, focused fury. It was not a performance for the benefit of the ranch hands who occasionally glanced in. It was the physical expression of her nature. Order from chaos, clean from dirty. She moved with an economy of motion that bespoke years of practice. There were no wasted steps, no hesitant gestures. She scraped, she scrubbed, she scoured. She boiled water on the big cast iron stove and used it to sterilize every plate, cup, and piece of cutlery. The stacked pots and pans were attacked one by one until they gleamed a dull, respectable pewter. The wooden countertops were scrubbed down to the bare wood, their surfaces smelling of soap and lemon oil she found in a dusty bottle, not rancid fat. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks in the west, the transformation was nearly complete. The air in the cookhouse was now warm and smelled of soap and the beginnings of cooking food. Large pot of water was on to boil for potatoes. On the freshly cleaned counter sat a bowl of flour, salt, and lard, ready to be turned into biscuits. Cora had found a sack of dried pinto beans and burned, and they were soaking. There was half a smoked ham, some onions, and a surprising stash of tinned peaches. It was enough. It would be more than enough. The first man to witness the change up close was the youngest of the crew, a boy named Jesse with a shock of blonde hair and a shy smile. He was sent by Silas to see if they were going to get fed at all. He poked his head through the door, his expression wary, and then his eyes widened. He stared at the clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the woman moving calmly by the stove. "Ma'am," he asked, his voice hesitant. "Supper will be ready in an hour," Cora said, not turning around. "Biscuits, ham, and fried potatoes. Tinned peaches for after." Jesse just stared. The previous cook's idea of supper was a lukewarm slurry of beans and bacon grease served with a side of profanity. "Biscuits," he said, as if it were an exotic word. "That's what I said." Cora glanced over her shoulder. She saw he was just a boy, barely 20, with the open, honest face of someone not yet soured by the world. "Tell the others, and wash your hands before you come to the table." Jesse fled, his report spreading through the bunkhouse like a prairie fire. By the time Cora rang the heavy iron triangle outside the door, 20 men were lined up, their faces a mixture of suspicion and hope. They filed in, their boots loud on the clean floorboards. They looked around, murmuring to each other. The room was not just clean, it felt different. It felt cared for. They took their seats at the long trestle tables, which had also been scrubbed. Cora worked with the same unhurried efficiency. She sliced the ham, fried the potatoes golden brown, and pulled a tray of perfectly risen golden-top biscuits from the oven. The smell alone was a revelation. She placed the platters on the tables, along with a pot of strong hot coffee. Then she retreated to the stove, turning her back on them to give them the privacy to eat and pass judgment. She did not eat herself. She watched and she listened. The first sound was a collective, appreciative silence, the clatter of forks and knives. Then a low murmur. "Damn," someone said, his mouth full. "These are actual biscuits." Another man, a grizzled old-timer with a face like a dried apple, held up a piece of ham on his fork. "It ain't burnt." This passed for the highest of compliments from her post. Cora saw Silas, the foreman, take a biscuit. He broke it in half, his expression critical. He spread a little butter on it, took a bite, chewed slowly. He did not look at Cora, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. Ease just a fraction. He had been ready to find fault, and he had failed. She saw Edna Barlow enter and stand by the door, her arms crossed. Edna did not take a plate. She observed the scene, her face unreadable. She watched her men eat with a quiet contentment she had not seen in years. She watched them pass the platter of biscuits, saw one man offer the last one to his neighbor. These were small things, but on a ranch running on a frayed thread of morale, they were not small at all. Her gaze shifted to the woman by the stove. Cora was now wiping down the counter she had just used, her movements fluid and automatic. Not lazy, not beaten, just running on a kind of stubborn momentum. Edna's eyes narrowed. This was not the work of a drifter looking for a free meal. This was the work of a professional. Later that night, after the last of the men had departed, full and strangely quiet, Cora finished cleaning. The kitchen was spotless, ready for the morning. In the small storage room, Leo was already asleep on the cot, a threadbare blanket pulled up to his chin. Cora sat on the edge of the bed, the exhaustion she had held at bay all day finally settling into her bones. She had done it. She had survived the first day. She had proven she could do the work. She looked at her son's peaceful face, the tension smoothed away in sleep. This small, dusty room was not a home, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the possibility of one. In the main room, on the cooling stove, sat a small bowl covered with a damp cloth. Inside, flour and water were beginning the slow, magical process of fermentation, a quiet promise of bread to come. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of working men. Cora rose before dawn, the cookhouse her silent kingdom in the pre-light hours. The first thing she did was check her sourdough starter. It had come to life on the third day, a bubbly, sour-smelling miracle that she treated with the reverence of a state secret. Its health was the health of the kitchen. From it came the daily bread, the breakfast pancakes, the biscuits that were already becoming legendary among the hands. Her competence became a quiet, undeniable fact of life on the Barlow Ranch. It was in the coffee, which was always strong and hot. It was in the stews, which were rich and varied. It was in the mending basket she kept by the stove, where shirts with torn sleeves and socks with worn heels appeared overnight and were returned the next day, repaired with tiny, near-invisible stitches. No one asked her to do it. She simply saw a need and met it. The men's initial suspicion softened into a deep, if unspoken, respect. They started wiping their boots before entering the cookhouse. They began to say please and thank you. They stopped swearing, at least until they were out of earshot of the kitchen door. They were rough men, but they recognized and valued competence. Cora, in turn, learned their habits. She knew who liked his coffee black, who preferred an extra piece of pie, who was partial to her apple crumble. She learned their names and faces, though she rarely spoke to them beyond what was necessary. She was their cook, their laundress, their mender. She was the quiet center of their domestic world. Her first true ally was Jesse, young hand. He would often linger after meals ostensibly to help clear the tables, but really just to be in the calm space Cora had created. He started talking to Leo, who would sit quietly in a corner of the kitchen, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Jesse would crouch down and talk to the boy about horses, or show him a strangely shaped rock he'd found. One afternoon he presented Leo with a small, crudely but lovingly whittled wooden horse. Leo took it, his small fingers tracing its shape. He looked up at Jesse, and then at his mother, and a tiny, fleeting smile touched his lips. It was the first Cora had seen in months. Her gratitude toward the young man was a fierce, silent thing. The old sage of the crew was a man named Gus, who had worked for Edna's husband and for Edna's father before that. Knack. He was a man of few words, preferring to communicate through grunts and nods. For the first week he had simply eaten his food, scraped his plate clean, and left. Then one evening, after finishing a bowl of Cora's beef and barley soup, he stopped by the stove on his way out. Cora was kneading dough for the next day's bread. Gus stood there for a long moment, watching her strong, rhythmic movements. "My mother made bread like that," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. He nodded once, a gesture of profound approval, and then walked out. From that day on, Gus was her staunchest, if quietest, defender. But not everyone was won over. The resistor to change, the foreman Silas saw Cora's growing influence as a threat to the established order. He was a man who understood a hierarchy of muscle and swagger, and Cora operated entirely outside of it. She did not defer to him. She did not seek his approval. She simply did her job with an unnerving perfection that made his own authority feel diminished. he began to find fault. "Using a lot of flour, aren't you?" he remarked one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe, watching her. "At this rate, the supply wagon will need to come twice a month." "I use what's necessary to feed 20 men bread they'll actually eat, instead of using it for doorstops," Cora replied without looking up from the apple she was peeling. His eyes narrowed. "Place is starting to smell like a damn bakery. This is a cattle ranch. Men need meat and beans, not fancy bread and pies." "They get meat and beans," Cora said, her voice even. "They also get bread and pie. A crew works better on a full stomach." "That's good for the ranch, isn't it, Mr. Silas?" His resentment simmered. He saw the respect the other men gave her, and it chafed him. He saw the way Edna Barlow had started taking her evening coffee in the kitchen, sitting at the table while Cora cleaned up, the two of them sometimes talking in low voices. He had been Edna's foreman for 5 years, her right hand, but now he felt a shift in the currents of power. He decided to force the issue. He waited until a day when he knew the week's accounts were due. He found Edna in her small, cluttered office, a room that stood in stark contrast to the order of Cora's kitchen. He took off his hat, a gesture of formal complaint. "Edna," he began, "we need to talk about the cook." Edna looked up from a stack of invoices, her expression weary. "What about her, Silas? Her expenses," he said, choosing his attack carefully. "She's spending too much. Peaches in a can, lemon oil, all sorts of fripperies. We're trying to run a tight ship here. We can't afford a fancy city cook." Edna frowned. It was true that the supplies Cora had requested were different from the old cook's lists of cheap lard and bulk beans. "She says she's saving money," says Silas scoffed. "I'd like to see the proof of that." "Then let's go see it," Edna said, rising from her chair. She was tired of the friction, tired of Silas's constant complaining. She would settle this. It was mid-afternoon, and Cora was at the long table, working dough for that evening's biscuits. Leo was at her feet playing with his wooden horse. The air was warm and smelled of yeast and cinnamon. "Cora," Edna said, her voice clipped, "Silas has concerns about your expenditures. He feels you're being wasteful." Cora did not stop her work. Her hands continued to push and fold the dough with a steady, practiced rhythm. She looked from Silas's smug face to Edna's troubled one. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and walked over to a small wooden box on a shelf. From it, she took out a ledger book. It was a simple, cheap thing, but inside the pages were filled with her neat, precise handwriting. She opened it on the table, next to her half-finished biscuits. "This is the ledger," she said, her voice calm and businesslike. "I keep a record of everything. Here," she pointed with a clean finger, "is the inventory of the pantry as I found it. Here's a list of everything that was thrown out due to spoilage or vermin. 3 sacks of weevil-infested flour, a side of bacon gone rancid, a total of $17 in waste." Silas shifted his weight. He hadn't expected this level of organization. "Here," Cora continued, turning a page, "is a record of every meal served, and the supplies used to make it. And here," she turned another page, "are the accounts. The cost, per man, per day, for the last cook was 41 cents. My cost, including the 10 peaches and the lemon oil, is 36 cents. She looked directly at Silas. "I am saving this ranch 5 cents per man, per day. For a crew of 20, that's $1 a day, or $30 a month. That's the price of a good horse." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The neat columns of figures, the undeniable logic, were more powerful than any shouted accusation. She stood there, a dusting of flour on her cheek, holding not a weapon, but a ledger. It was the tool of her trade, and she wielded it with absolute confidence. From Edna's viewpoint, the scene in the kitchen was a revelation. She had expected a shouting match, a messy, emotional confrontation. Instead, she was witnessing a quiet execution. She looked at the ledger. The handwriting was clearer than a bank clerk's. The numbers were stark and irrefutable. She had been running this ranch on instinct and memory for years. Her office a chaotic mess of half-paid bills and unread letters. This woman, this supposed drifter, had brought a level of order and clarity to one corner of the ranch that Edna hadn't seen since her husband was alive. She looked at Silas. He was staring at the ledger, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He had come to her with rumors and feelings. Cora Halloran had met him with facts. Edna felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in a long time. A clear, uncomplicated certainty. "Is there anything else, Silas?" Edna asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Silas looked up, flustered. "Well, the men, a woman's presence." "The men seem happier and better fed than they've been in years." Edna cut him off. "Gus told me yesterday he hasn't eaten this well since his mother was alive. The work is getting done. The roundup is on schedule." She turned her gaze to Cora, who had gone back to her biscuits, her point made. "The arrangement stands, in fact," Edna added, a new thought solidifying. "I'm putting you in charge of all ranch supplies, Cora, not just the kitchen. From now on, Silas, if you need a new rope or a box of nails, you'll clear it with her." Blow was perfectly landed. It was a public and complete validation of Cora, and a sharp rebuke to Silas. It elevated Cora from cook to quartermaster. Silas stood frozen for a second, his mouth slightly open. He looked at Edna, then at Cora's back. Without another word, he turned and stalked out of the cookhouse, slamming the door behind him. Edna watched him go, then looked around the clean, warm kitchen. She looked at the sleeping child, the methodical woman, the promise of a good meal. "He'll come around," she said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. "It doesn't matter if he does," Cora said, placing the last biscuit on the baking tray. "The work will still get done." Edna nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand that, for Cora Halloran, that was the only thing that ever mattered. The foreman's defeat marked a subtle but significant turning point. Cora's authority over the ranch's domestic sphere was now absolute, sanctioned directly by Edna. Silas, though still sullen, ceased his open challenges. He would submit his requests for supplies on a piece of paper left on the kitchen counter, and Cora would approve them with the same dispassionate efficiency she applied to everything else. The quiet war was over, and competence had won. This new responsibility gave Cora a legitimate reason to enter the one part of the ranch that remained a bastion of chaos, Edna's office. It was a small room off the main house's living area, crammed with 10 years of accumulated paperwork. Ledgers, receipts, and legal documents were piled on every surface, coated in a fine layer of dust. It was a room that shouted of a burden carried alone for too long. "I need to make sense of this if I am to manage the supplies properly," Cora explained to Edna one evening. "I need to know what you've been paying for things, who your suppliers are." Edna waved a hand at the mess, a gesture of weary surrender. "Be my guest. I think Jacob's father's last will and testament is in there somewhere. Might be holding up that stack of livestock journals from '78. There was a hint of dry humor in her voice, the kind that grows out of long acquaintance with hopelessness. So Cora began a new task in the quiet hours after the kitchen was clean and Leo was asleep. She would light a single lantern and enter the office, bringing her own brand of quiet order to the paper chaos. She worked methodically, as always. She sorted, she stacked, she read. She was not just looking for receipts for flour and nails. She was a student of the ranch's history, its triumphs, and its slow decline. She saw the story in the changing price of beef, in the desperate letters to the bank, the dwindling list of suppliers. It was in a dusty leather-bound box tied with a faded ribbon that she found the heart of the ranch's legal life. Inside were the original deeds, the survey maps drawn on brittle, yellowed linen, and the water rights agreements, written out in the florid looping script of a territorial clerk from 40 years prior. Cora had learned from her late husband the vital importance of such documents. Land was nothing without the water that fed it. She spread the main survey map out on the floor, weighting its curling corners with books. She traced the boundaries of the Barlow property with her finger. Then she studied the water rights. The ranch was fed by two main sources, the wide, dependable Grable River to the south and a smaller, seasonal waterway called Antelope Creek, which trickled down from the high country and crossed the northern edge of Barlow land before running onto the property of their neighbor Marcus Thorne. The agreement was ancient and explicit. The Barlow Ranch had rights to 60% of the creek's flow during the dry months of July and August. Something about it snagged her attention. She remembered conversations she'd overheard among the men, complaining about how low Antelope Creek had been running the past few summers, how the northern pastures had been drier than usual. Everyone had blamed the lack of rain. Cora found a more recent, but still old, hand-drawn map of the pastures. She compared it to the official survey. She spent 2 nights just looking, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she saw it. It was a small, almost imperceptible difference. On the old survey, Antelope Creek took a sharp, right-angle turn onto Barlow land. On the newer map, that turn was softer, a gentle curve. The difference was only a few hundred yards, but over that distance the creek ran through a shallow, porous basin on Thorne's land before it ever reached the Barlow property line. It was like a slow, seeping wound. The next morning she sought out Gus, the old hand. "Gus," she said quietly, catching him as he was heading to the corral. "You've been here a long time. Do you remember when Marcus Thorne put in that new fence line up by Antelope Creek? The one with the stone posts." Gus squinted, thinking. "Must be 8, 9 years ago now." Said he was just shoring up his boundary. "Looked real solid. Did the creek seem to run lower after that?" Gus's eyes narrowed. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Now that you mention it, we all figured it was the drought years, but it never rightly came back, did it?" That evening, Cora waited until Edna had finished her coffee and was about to head to her own bed. "Edna, could I show you something in the office? Curious." Edna followed her. Cora had cleared the large desk. On it, she had laid out the original survey, the newer pasture map, and the water rights document. With the calm, clear logic she had used to dismantle Silas, she laid out her discovery. This is the legal boundary and the path of the creek from the original survey in 1847, she began, her finger tracing the ink line. "It makes a sharp turn here. This is where the creek is supposed to enter your land." and this document gives you rights to 60% of its flow. She then pointed to the other map. This is a map someone drew maybe 15 years ago. See how the turn is different? It's softer. And right here, she tapped a spot on Thorne's side of the line, is that little basin Gus talks about. Thorne's new fence line follows this softer curve. He didn't move the boundary, not technically. He just encouraged the creek to take a different path onto his land first. She paused, letting the implications sink in. He's not just using his 40% of the water. He's letting a good portion of your 60% seep into his own ground before it ever reaches you. He's been stealing your water, a little bit at a time, for almost a decade. Edna stared at the maps, her face pale in the lantern light. She sank into her chair, her tough facade crumbling for the first time in Cora's presence. She looked small and profoundly tired. "That bastard," she whispered. "That smiling, church-going bastard." She traced the path of the creek herself as if her finger could feel the stolen water. "I knew something was wrong. The grass up north is thin. I've had to move the herd south earlier every year. I thought I was just failing, that I wasn't as good at this as Jacob was." It was a moment of profound vulnerability, an admission she would have made to no one else. In that moment, her perception of Cora shifted completely. This woman was not just a cook, not just a quartermaster. She was an ally, a strategist. She was a mind as sharp as her own, but with a patience for detail that Edna had long since lost to exhaustion. "What do we do?" Edna asked, her voice quiet. It was the question of a partner, not a boss. "The first step is to send him a letter," Cora said, her voice gentle but firm. "A formal letter. You state the terms of the 1847 water agreement, and you assert your legal right to the flow, as defined by the original survey. You don't accuse him of anything. You simply state the facts and inform him that you will be taking measures to ensure the creek follows its legally designated course. I've already drafted it for you." She slid a clean sheet of paper across the desk. The letter was written in the same neat, clear hand as the ledger. It was polite, professional, and utterly uncompromising. Edna read it. A slow, hard smile touched her lips. It was the smile of a fighter who had just been handed a new, sharp weapon. "He won't like this," she said. "No," Cora agreed. "He won't. He's a powerful man in this county. The sheriff is his cousin." "The law is the law," Cora said simply. "And the survey is the survey. The facts are on your side." Edna looked up from the letter, her eyes meeting Cora's across the desk. The vast gulf that had existed between the ranch owner and the desperate woman on her doorstep had vanished. In its place was a bridge of mutual respect, built plank by plank with competence, honesty, and shared purpose. "I'll have Jessie ride this into town tomorrow," Edna said, her voice regaining its strength. She signed the letter with a firm, decisive stroke. "Thank you, Cora. You're welcome, Edna," Cora replied. Later that night, as she lay on her cot, listening to her son's steady breathing, Cora knew she had done more than just uncover a deception. She had defended the ranch, and in defending it, she had taken another step toward making it her own. The letter delivered by Jessie into the hands of a startled Marcus Thorne himself had the effect of a stone thrown into a stagnant pond. For 2 weeks, the only response was a tense, rippling silence. The men on the Barlow Ranch felt it. There was an edge to the air, a sense of a storm gathering just over the horizon. Thorne was seen riding the fence line near Antelope Creek more often, his face a thundercloud. Edna and Cora waited. They spoke little of it, but it was a constant unspoken presence in their evening conversations over coffee. Edna was coiled tight, a spring of anger and anxiety. She had poked the bear, and now she was waiting for it to attack. Cora, for her part, remained outwardly calm, but she found herself watching the road that led to the ranch more often, her senses on high alert. The attack, when it came, was not the direct frontal assault Edna had expected. Marcus Thorne was too clever for that. He did not ride over with armed men. He did not contest the water rights directly, because he knew, thanks to Cora's research, that he would lose. He chose a different weapon, a more insidious one. He chose the law, or his own corrupted version of it. It was a hot, still afternoon. The roundup was in full swing, and most of the hands, including Silas and Jesse, were out with the herd. The ranch was quiet, inhabited only by Edna, who was repairing a bridle on the porch, Gus, who was dozing in a chair in the shade of the barn, and Cora, who was in the kitchen with Leo, shelling peas. The sound of an approaching wagon broke the stillness. It wasn't the familiar rattle of the supply wagon. This was faster, more purposeful. Cora moved to the kitchen window. A dusty buggy, pulled by a single, sweating horse, was coming up the lane. 2 men were inside. One was Marcus Thorne, his face set in a grim, satisfied mask. The other, Thorne's cousin. Cora's heart went cold. She put a hand on Leo's shoulder. "Stay here," she said softly. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out of the kitchen just as Edna was stepping off the porch, the half-mended bridle still in her hand. The buggy stopped in the middle of the yard, kicking up a cloud of dust. Sheriff Brody, a fleshy man whose uniform was stretched tight across his belly, climbed down. He hitched his gun belt and walked toward them, holding a piece of paper. Thorne remained in the buggy, watching the scene unfold like a spectator at a play he had written. "Edna," the sheriff said, his tone attempting a folksy friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon."
"Brody," Edna replied, her voice flat. "What do you want?"
"If this is about the creek, you can talk to my lawyer." She didn't have a lawyer, but it sounded good. "This ain't about the creek," the sheriff said, his gaze sliding past Edna to fix on Cora. "This is about her." He jabbed a thumb in Cora's direction. Cora felt a chill crawl up her spine despite the heat. She stood her ground, her hands clasped in front of her. "I've had a formal complaint," Brody announced, his voice taking on an official, pompous tone. "From a concerned citizen," he nodded toward Thorne. "A complaint about a vagrant woman and her child residing in this county without visible means of support or legal employment." Edna let out a bark of incredulous laughter. "Vagrant. She's my cook. She works harder than any 3 men I know." "Is she on your payroll?" the sheriff asked, his eyes glinting. "Do you have a formal signed employment contract? Because the law is very clear on these matters." "An unattached woman traveling with a minor, with no formal position. She can be declared a ward of the county, or encouraged to move along. For her own good. You understand." The trap was sprung. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Edna had never thought to sign a contract. The arrangement had been a verbal one, a trial. In the eyes of Thorne's law, Cora was nothing. She had no legal standing. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Edna snarled, taking a step forward. "You're doing his dirty work for him, Brody, and you know it." The sheriff held up the paper. This is a legal notice. It gives this woman," he squinted at the paper, "Cora Halloran, 48 hours to vacate the county. After that, she'll be arrested for vagrancy." He took a step toward Cora and tried to hand her the paper. "It's the law, ma'am." Cora did not take it. She looked at the smug face of Marcus Thorne in the buggy, at the corrupt sheriff, and at the fury and helplessness warring in Edna's eyes. She felt Leo's small hand slip into hers. He had come to stand beside her. In that moment, all the progress she had made, the respect she had earned, the fragile sense of place she had begun to build, it all seemed to be turning to dust. She was being erased by a piece of paper. Toe. From Edna's perspective, a red wave of fury washed over her. This was her ranch, her land. And these men were standing in her yard, trying to dictate who could and could not live on it. They were using this good, capable woman as a pawn in their game to steal her water, her livelihood. The injustice of it was so profound it made her shake. Her first instinct was to grab the shotgun she kept just inside the door. But she knew that was a losing game. Brody was the law, however twisted. Thorne was wealth and influence. Violence would only get her arrested and cost her the ranch for good. She was trapped. For the first time in a decade of fighting tooth and nail to keep her property, she felt utterly, completely powerless. Thorne had found her weak point. It wasn't her finances or her fences. It was her growing reliance on her growing affection for the woman standing beside her. He was trying to rip the new heart out of her home. "You can't do this," Edna said, her voice trembling with rage. "I won't let you." "It's not up to you, Edna," the sheriff said, his patience wearing thin. "The law's the law. She has 2 days to pack her bags and go. I'd advise you to convince her. It'll be easier on the boy." He tossed the notice onto the dirt at Cora's feet. "My duty here is done." He turned to walk back to the buggy. His mission accomplished, Thorne allowed himself a wider, more triumphant smile. He had won. He had severed the ranch's new lifeline. Without Cora's sharp mind, the water rights issue would die, and Edna would be alone and overwhelmed once more. Edna felt a despair so sharp it was like a physical blow. She looked at Cora, expecting to see fear or tears, but Cora's face was a mask of calm stillness. She was looking at the paper in the dust, but her mind was clearly somewhere else, working at a furious pace. The sight of that unyielding composure in the face of ruin gave Edna a sliver of something to hold on to. She didn't know what Cora was thinking, but she knew she wasn't beaten yet. The sheriff had his hand on the side of the buggy, ready to climb back in. Marcus Thorne was already picturing his victory, the eventual, inevitable sale of the Barlow Ranch to him for a pittance. The matter seemed concluded. But then Edna moved. She walked past Cora and planted herself directly in front of the sheriff, blocking his path. Her body was rigid, her face set like granite. "She's not going anywhere," Edna said, her voice low and dangerous. Sheriff Brody sighed, a sound of put-upon exasperation. "Edna, don't make this difficult. I have the law on my side. Now, step aside." "This is my land," Edna said, her voice rising. His father before him. "You will not come here and enforce a trumped-up charge for that snake." She jabbed a finger toward Thorne. "You'll have to drag me out of the way first." It was a magnificent, feudal gesture. A stand made of pure, righteous anger. Thorne laughed. Short, ugly sound. "Don't be a fool, Edna. You're an old woman playing a losing hand." The sheriff reached out to take Edna's arm. "Come on now. Let's not have any trouble." It was at that moment that Cora spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Wait. All three of them turned to look at her. She had not moved. She still stood with Leo's hand in hers. She had not picked up the notice from the dust. Her gaze was fixed on Edna. "He's using the law, Edna," Cora said, her voice clear and steady. "So we have to use it better." She took a step forward, moving past Edna to stand before the sheriff. She was not holding a weapon. She was not shouting. Her hands were empty. Her power was not in her fist, but behind her eyes. It was the power of knowledge, of nights spent poring over the history of this land, of a mind that saw solutions where others saw only walls. "Sheriff," she said, addressing Brody directly.
"You are correct that I do not have a formal employment contract."
The sheriff puffed out his chest.
"See? She admits it. Now, if you'll just pack your—"
"However," Cora continued, cutting him off smoothly, "your complaint is based on the premise that I am a vagrant with no legal standing on this property. That premise is incorrect." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the sheriff's face. Thorne leaned forward in his seat, his smug smile faltering. What was this woman talking about? Cora turned to Edna. "Edna, in the box of original charters, do you remember the territorial partnership provision of 1867? Edna stared at her, uncomprehending. "The what?" "It's an old piece of territorial law," Cora explained, her voice patient, as if she were teaching a class. "It was designed for situations just like this, for isolated holdings in undeveloped territories. It allows a primary landowner to enter into a binding partnership with any individual deemed essential to the continued operation and preservation of the holding. It grants that individual immediate legal standing as a co-proprietor. It was intended to secure the skills of blacksmiths, or water diviners, or managers. It bypasses the need for traditional employment contracts. It's still on the books. I checked." The full, audacious brilliance of the strategy dawned on Edna. Her jaw went slack with astonishment. She looked at Cora, this quiet woman she had almost turned away, and felt a wave of awe. Cora was not finished. He looked back at the sheriff. A vagrant is, by legal definition, a person without a settled home or regular work. If Mrs. Barlow declares me her partner, under that provision, I will have both. I will be a legal resident and a co-owner of this property. Your vagrancy complaint would be null and void. The silence in the ranch yard was absolute. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Gus had risen from his chair by the barn and was watching, his mouth agape. Thorne found his voice first. That's preposterous. A century-old obscure law. It won't stand up." "It has never been repealed," Cora stated calmly. "It is the law, Sheriff. You're a stickler for the law, aren't you?" Sheriff Brody looked from Cora's unshakable face to Thorne's sputtering one, and then to Edna, who was now gazing at Cora with something akin to reverence. He was a bully and a political hack, but he wasn't a complete fool. He was out of his depth. This wasn't a simple matter of intimidating a helpless woman anymore. This involved property rights and legal statutes he'd never even heard of. Edna Barlow found her footing. The fury was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She was no longer just defending her cook. She was making the best business decision of her life. She looked Sheriff Brody square in the eye. "She is right," Edna declared, her voice ringing with renewed authority. "As of this moment, pursuant to the Territorial Partnership Provision of 1867, I, Edna Barlow, sole proprietor of this ranch, do hereby declare Cora Halloran to be my full and legal partner in this enterprise." She turned to Cora. "Is a verbal declaration enough?" "It is," Cora said, "but a written one is better." She walked into the house and returned a moment later with a piece of paper and a pen from the office. It was the partnership agreement, already written out in her perfect script, leaving only the signature line blank. She had been prepared. In the middle of the dusty ranch yard, with the corrupt sheriff and the vanquished land baron as her witnesses, Edna Barlow took the pen. Using the flat surface of the buggy's fender, she signed her name. The scratch of the nib was the only sound. She handed the pen to Cora. Cora signed her name below Edna's. Cora Halloran. She held up the paper. "Sheriff Brody," she said, "I am no longer a vagrant. I am a landowner. Now, I believe you are about to leave." The sheriff stared at the document. He looked at Thorne, who was pale with rage, his plan utterly demolished. Thorne had sought to use the law as a club, and this quiet woman had just revealed it to be a shield, one she knew how to wield far better than he did. Brody's authority had evaporated. He was just a man in a dusty yard holding a useless piece of paper. Without another word, he snatched the vagrancy notice from the dirt, crumpled it in his fist, and climbed into his buggy. He didn't look at Edna or Cora. He looked at Thorne. "Let's go, Marcus." Thorne gave Cora one last look, a look of pure, undiluted hatred, but it was the impotent hatred of the defeated. The buggy turned and clattered away down the road, leaving a trail of dust and humiliation in its wake. When they were gone, an immense silence descended upon the yard. Edna, Cora, Gus, and little Leo stood in the afternoon sun. Edna looked at the signed paper in Cora's hand. She looked at the woman who had not only saved herself, but had just fundamentally secured the future of the Barlow Ranch. The external threat was not just foiled, it was broken. By making Cora a partner, they now had the legal standing and the intellectual firepower to formally and successfully challenge the water theft. Thorne hadn't just lost the battle, he had lost the war. Edna let out a long, shuddering breath. It wasn't a breath of weariness, it was a breath of profound, unburdening relief. She started to laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it grew until it was a full, rich, joyous laugh that echoed off the barn. Gus cracked a rare, wide smile. Leo, sensing the shift, squeezed his mother's hand. Cora watched Edna laugh, and for the first time since she had arrived, a genuine, unburdened smile touched her own lips. That evening, the atmosphere in the cookhouse was transformed. The tension that had hovered over the ranch for weeks had vanished, replaced by a quiet, celebratory air. When the hands returned from the roundup, tired and dusty, the news spread through them like a warm current. Gus, in an uncharacteristically verbose moment, recounted the entire confrontation in the yard, his narrative punctuated by admiring grunts and shakes of his head. Jesse looked at Cora with open hero worship. Even Silas seemed to have been shaken from his resentment. He ate his dinner in silence, but there was a new look in his eyes when he glanced at Cora. Not of fear, but of grudging, absolute respect. He had witnessed a display of power far more impressive than any fist or gun after the men had eaten and departed, leaving the kitchen filled with the comfortable quiet of a job well done. Cora began her nightly ritual of cleaning. Edna sat at the long trestle table, a cup of coffee in her hands, watching her. The comfortable silence stretched between them, no longer the silence of two strangers, but of two partners who had just weathered a great storm together.
I thought I was just hiring a cook, Edna said finally, her voice soft in the warm, lamp-lit room. She turned the cup in her hands, studying it as if it held the answer to a deep question. I was tired, Cora, so tired of fighting alone. I thought all I needed was someone to keep the men fed so I could keep my head above water. Cora paused in her wiping of the counter, her back to Edna. You needed more than a cook. I needed more than a cook, Edna agreed, a note of wonder in her voice. I needed a partner. I just didn't know it. Jacob, my husband, he used to handle the books, the legal papers. He had a mind for it. When he died, I tried, but it was never my strength. I can read a cow or the sky, but I can't read the fine print. The ranch has been slowly bleeding out for 10 years. She looked up, her gaze meeting Cora's reflection in the dark window pane. It seems I found the one person who could. Cora turned around, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked over to the table and sat down opposite Edna. The signed partnership agreement lay on the table between them, silent testament to the day's events. Edna pushed the paper across the smooth, scrubbed wood toward Cora. This isn't just for show, she said, her voice earnest and low. It's not just a trick to get rid of Brody and Thorne. It's real. I meant every word of it. This ranch, it's as much yours as it is mine now. If you'll have it, it was the permanent offer. Not a proposal of marriage, but something far more profound in their world. It was an offer of equal standing, of a shared burden and a shared future. It was the end of the trial. Cora looked at the paper, at Edna's tired but hopeful face. She thought of the long, dusty road that had led her here, the desperation that had been her only companion. She had arrived as a beggar offering her skills in exchange for mere survival. Now she was being offered a kingdom. Her gaze drifted to the open door of the small storage room. Leo was asleep on the cot, his face peaceful in the dim light. The room was no longer just a dusty closet. It had a small hand-woven rug on the floor that Cora had made from scraps. A shelf on the wall held Leo's wooden horse and a small collection of interesting rocks. It was a child's room. It was his room. She looked back at Edna. She had not come here seeking a home, only a sanctuary. She had not sought a partner, only a wage. But in the soil of this struggling ranch, through the steady application of her own quiet competence, she accepted, not out of desperation, but out of choice. This was a place she had helped to save. This was a place she wanted to stay. I'll have it, Cora said, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. She slid the paper back toward the center of the table, a shared document for a shared life. A single tear traced a path through the dust and wrinkles on Edna's cheek. She wiped it away impatiently. Good, she said, her voice gruff to cover the tremor. Because the north pasture fence needs mending, and Thorne's water theft has put us behind schedule for the season. We have work to do. Music, the weeks that followed, settled into a new, more harmonious rhythm. The Cora Halloran Ranch, as it was now legally known, began to heal. Under Cora's meticulous management, the water from Antelope Creek was restored to its rightful channel. The northern pastures, given water and rest, began to show signs of new life. The ranch's finances, once a tangled mess, were now organized in Cora's neat ledger, and for the first time in a decade, the ranch was turning a small but steady profit. The final scene is not one of high drama, but of quiet, profound peace. It is a late afternoon in the fall. The air is crisp and smells of wood smoke and curing hay. In the kitchen, which is now the undisputed heart of the entire ranch, Cora is kneading a massive ball of dough for the week's bread. Her movements are strong, sure, and content. The late afternoon sun streams through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and catching the gold in her hair. Across the room, in her favorite chair by the now cool stove, Edna Barlow sits cleaning a rifle. Her movements are as practiced and economical as Cora's, but there is a relaxation in her shoulders that has not been there for years. The deep lines of worry on her face have softened. She is no longer carrying the world alone. At the big table, Leo sits with a pencil and a notebook Jesse bought him in town. He is no longer silent. He hums softly to himself as he sketches, his brow furrowed in concentration. He is drawing the cattle. He can see out the window, his lines surprisingly sure and steady for a boy. His age, the ranch is his world, and he is capturing it on paper. The kitchen door opens. He removes his hat as he crosses the threshold, a gesture of deep-seated respect. The last of his resentment has long since been weathered away by Cora's undeniable competence and fairness. "Ma'am," he says, addressing both women, "the west fence is secure. Gus and Jesse are bringing the strays in. I'm heading to town for the mail. Is there anything you need?" Cora looks up from her dough. "We're low on coffee, Silas." "And see if they have any of that ribbon candy Leo likes." She smiles at him, and he gives a small, shy smile in return before nodding and departing. Edna clicks the rifle's action shut, the sound clean and satisfying. She looks at Cora, at the boy, at the warm, orderly room. She looks at the life they have built together from the edge of ruin. It is strong, it is real, it is secure, it is home. The Barlow Ranch had been waiting for a hero on a white horse, a savior to rescue it from its slow decay. What it got was something far better. What it got was the woman who made it a home.